The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Café. This is the United Podcast Network.
Want to shake up your small business marketing? I mean, really shake it up.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Have you been thinking about doing your own podcast?
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Would you like to take your business to the next level?
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
This is the golden age of podcasting, and it's time to stop thinking and start doing.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Get your message heard 24/7, 365, over and over again.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Welcome to the 21st century.
Welcome to the Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Here's the creator and host of the Studio 21 Podcast Café, David Garofalo.
Welcome, everybody, to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is a 21-minute or less weekly podcast to help you get your message out, grow your business, and build your bottom line. Let me help you bring your marketing and advertising into the 21st century. My name is David Garofalo. I've been doing podcasting since 2010 and created a six-figure income from doing so. So this is a 21-minute or less podcast. So let's start the clock, and here we go. Today's subject, can I swear on my podcast? And should I? The short answer to this is, can I swear on my podcast? Yes. You can do whatever you want on your podcast. It's your podcast, and a podcast is different than a broadcast. In a broadcast on radio, Title 18 of the United States Code states, Section 1464 prohibits any obscene, indecent, or profane language by means of radio communication according to the FCC, Federal Communication Commission. Obscene speech is not protected by the First Amendment, and broadcasters are prohibited by statute and regulations from airing obscene programming at any time. But that's broadcast. We're talking about podcasting. When it comes to a podcast, it's different. Podcasts are fully exempt. So what are the words? When we're saying profanity and swearing on podcasts, one may think, and I'm old enough to remember, that George Carlin did a skit with the 7 dirty words. That was just a comedy act. Those are just some of the many words that are offensive. If it seems offensive, it probably is. So obscene, offensive words. Yes, you can swear and use all the obscene, indecent, and profound language that you want when you're doing a podcast. But is that what you want to do? Should you? Will it help or hurt your podcast by doing that? So let's get into it. Number 1, be warned. The use of explicit language in the title, description, or cover art of the podcast, even a tag, you will be punished. Not by your mother, but worse, by iTunes and Google. Explicit tags do not go forward as easily as shows that don't use explicit language or wording on their titles or tags or language, especially on iTunes. Here's another warning. Do not swear in the notes at all, ever. The explicit podcast with swearing should be checked off as explicit podcast so the listener can opt in or opt out by seeing that. You're letting them know that it's there and they can opt in or opt out. But if it's in your notes and they can read it without having to opt in, then you will be punished for doing that. It's there. They did not opt in for it. You're going to use it anyway, and you will be punished, again, not by your mother, by Google and YouTube and iTunes and everything else, which could be worse. Depends who your mother is. So here's the first takeaway. You shouldn't use swear words in your title, description, cover art, notes, or tags. But how about in your language? Should you swear on your podcast? Consider your audience. Podcasts are consumed by people of all ages. You should always keep that in mind. Does your inclusion of swear words make you more or less appealing to them? Will you be looking for advertisers and sponsors of your show someday? Will your profanity help or hurt your ability to get them on board? These are things you have to think about now as you're planning your podcast or beginning your podcast and you're putting that in there. Can it help or hurt you? It probably won't help, but it could hurt. But it's your choice. Again, you can do whatever you want because it's your podcast. But if you want your business to have more listeners and advertising, this might hurt you eventually. But then again, it depends on the type of show that you're going to do. In the case of this show, the Studio 21 Podcast Café, there is no reason for me to swear. I'm no saint. I've done it, but there's no need for me to insert it for any purpose. I thought about it for this exact episode and decided there's actually no need for it. You know what the swears are. Or is there? Is there a need for it? Podcasting is a form of free speech, and you are able to use profanity. In a conversation between you and a guest on your show, it may happen naturally, but adding it intentionally might get a laugh, but it also may hurt your podcast in the long run. People may think profanity means you don't have a good vocabulary. Others may think a clean podcast may be dull and unappealing. If the podcast is labeled clean, someone may skip over it, actually. The key is to know who you want your audience to be. Do you want children to be listening to your podcast or not? If you don't want children listening, someone may use the explicit tag on their podcast, even if they don't use the swear words, just to actually keep the kids away. But this might be a magnet for children. It's up to you to make the final decision. It could be reverse psychology, as an R-rated movie makes them more curious. Do you want to be perceived as an intellectual and a professional? Maybe having the explicit tag will hurt you in your show. Will there be negative consequences on iTunes, Stitcher, and the others because of the explicit tag that's set? Will iTunes not consider your podcast to be featured or new or noteworthy section? I'll dig into that, but first it's important. Listen to this.
If you're in the area of Boston North into southern New Hampshire and you're thinking about doing a podcast, there is a place you have to see. It's called Studio 21 Podcast Café. Located right over the border into Salem, New Hampshire, Studio 21 Podcast Café is a live, working, full-service podcast and vodcast, that's video on demand, studio. All professional equipment, professional producer, and total distribution of your podcast is done for you. Would you like search engine optimization for more people to find your business or better ranking on Google? Well, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe can do it all for you for far less than you think. Schedule a free 21-minute no-obligation consultation by going to www.studio21podcast.cafe. That's studio21podcast.cafe. Now, back to the program.
And we are back, and today we're talking about swearing on your podcast. Should you be doing it, or should you be leaving it out? First, who is your listener, and who would you like your potential listener to be? Do you want everyone? If you do, I think swearing may push some people away. Not me, but some people are going to be turned off and actually will turn you off. But if those people are not your audience anyway, maybe you don't care. Maybe the cursing will make your show more real, more entertaining, and more believable. But then again, maybe it'll make you seem less professional, and in turn people away and less of a chance for sponsors and advertisers. It comes down to the choice of the podcaster, you, and what you ultimately are trying to have being accomplished here. More downloads or more entertainment? More professional or more fun? Real or staged? There's a defining answer to this, and that is it depends. It depends on you and your show. What is best for your show, and you know your show better than I know your show. What do you want to accomplish doing your show? For me, on this show, on swearing, I chose not to swear. I thought about it. I rattled around for a while. Maybe I'd put them in there and sprinkle it around and put them in a comical way, and in the end, I decided to skip it. It wasn't going to help me get the point out what I'm trying to accomplish here. You don't have to do it, but nobody's going to stop you. Do you need help deciding? Contact me at dave@studio21podcast.cafe. That's dave@studio, the number 21, podcast.cafe. Schedule a free 21-minute meeting with me. Let me show you the studio, and we'll talk about your thoughts and plans, and I'll even buy you a cup of coffee. Next week, do you know it's my 21st podcast on the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe? I've talked about how and why you should be doing a podcast. I've talked over 8 hours now on the subject, and some might worry, will I eventually run out of subject matter? The answer is never. I will go on forever finding topics to talk about podcasting or just about anything. I've done over 1,000 hours on my other podcast that talks about cigars, and I still haven't run out of subject matter there. Finding topics should be easier than you think, if you think. We'll dig into that next week. That's my 21 minutes or less, and we are out of here. You've been listening to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, live from the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe on the United Podcast Network.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.